Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Yeah, welcome to this TED Talk of the ELINET network. So today we are very honored to have Dr. Lindsay Miller with us to talk about one of his projects on course design for English for science and technology. So a little bit of introduction of Lindsay. Well, I first met Lindsay about several years ago, when I was a secondary school teacher, and he gave he gave a talk on creativity in the classroom. Maybe you don't remember anymore. And then when I was doing my postgraduate diploma, he's the one who's been working on learner autonomy, teacher autonomy at that time. But Lindsay is more than that. So he's published a lot on autonomy. Second language listening, and all sort of things, and teacher education, TESOL. Most recently, I'm still using his book on English disciplines, English in the disciplines for course design in EAP or ESP classroom. So we are very honored to have him here. He's a local Scot and coming to Glasgow to do this talk live on Zoom. So welcome, Lindsay. Yeah, thank you. So the PowerPoints and the video will be available online later. So yeah, don't worry taking notes. So you will have the PowerPoints and all the links. So after you, Lindsay, I'll be off screen. So we'll have a Q&A session when about 30 minutes later. So off to you, Lindsay.
Right, thank you very much. Thanks, Jason, for the invitation to come here today. I might actually be the only Scot on the platform today, but never mind. And I'm going to talk about a course design for English and Science and Technology. But as I was saying to Yolanta there, this is actually coming from a publication, which is a book by Routledge, English and the Disciplines. And the link is posted on the chat there, if anyone wants to have a look at the book. And so what I'm going to try and do is very quickly cover some of the main areas, the main dimensions of course design coming from this book. And I'm going to try and do it very quickly. So I hope you don't mind if I'm speaking quickly. But as Jason said, the talk's going to be made available online later on. And so you can go back and listen to it again. Be good for your listening practice. So what we're going to do is have a quick look at the historical perspectives on EST. Just a few words about textbook development, because most of us use textbooks in our teaching courses, ESP, EAP. And then I'll talk about the course which I developed in Hong Kong for the students there. And then the future directions, which is multidimensional. And that's the areas where I think you need to pay some attention if you're examining an existing course or preparing for a new course in EAP or EST. I've used the term EST because it's relevant to science and technology, but it can be applied to any EAP type course. So basically, we all know that ESP or EST is not a new phenomena. It's been going on for thousands of years, basically, partly because of trade. When people started moving around about the world and started talking with each other, they had to find common languages, which were usually pidgin forms of a language. And so the whole concept of communicating in a second language has been around for a long, long time. However, the formalization of ESP started probably about 120, 130 years ago when textbooks started to be developed for teaching in classrooms. And that's where we can actually see then what people were trying to do in the classroom in terms of teaching ESP. The real commercialization, of course, started around about the 1960s. And that's a relevant period of time because that's when there was a big discovery of oil in the Middle East, especially in Iran, in North Africa, in Algeria, and in South America, in Brazil. There were lots of activities in terms of preparing courses to help local people be able to communicate with the English-speaking specialists who were going in to do the jobs of developing oil plants and things like this. And so we start seeing a lot more textbooks coming out around about that time. Of course, we all know that after the Second World War, there was a huge movement of people around about the world, especially in Europe. People were moving from country to country. And so a common language had to be developed in terms of helping these people into the job market. And English basically became that second language. And this is 1070s, but it's actually 1970s. Since the 1970s, there's been a big increase in awareness of the learner's needs in language education. So if we look at what's happened historically, there's a very clear chronological development in textbooks and in thinking, course development, from around about, well, the early 1960s. So we started off with a lexicogrammatical approach, grammar translation, basically. Then around about the mid-70s became the communicative language teaching area. That textbooks were not really developed until the late 1970s, but the concepts were around about early 1970s. Then we got into the idea of notions and functions in language teaching. And then, of course, we had a lot of emphasis on authentic materials. And that all came around about in the 1970s. Coming on from the communicative language teaching approach, we had the task-based approach, which was developed mostly in India, basically. And then this idea of team teaching became quite prominent in terms of EST. So having a specialist teacher and a language teacher in the classroom at the same time. And it was a really interesting concept and a very good concept, but very expensive to implement, of course. And then 1980s, Widdowson started making us more aware of discipline-specific teaching methods. So that was examining how the professors in the disciplines were teaching their students and carrying over some of that into English language teaching as well. Oops. So if you look at textbook development, which I've done quite a lot of, you can actually see I've divided it into 5 generations of textbooks. So first generations, early 60s to late 60s, and you get books such as The Structure of Technical English here. A lot of these textbooks you can go online and have a look at. There's probably an example somewhere online for them. But you'll see very clearly that that kind of book was very much a grammar translation type of book. Second generation, the course in Basic Scientific English, the Focus series and Nucleus series, these were very prominent in the late 1970s. And again, what was happening here was that the materials were being developed specifically for groups of science or technology type students, but they were very basic. They were black and white drawings and kind of exercises, mechanical exercises in the textbooks. Third generation became much more interesting. Books like Interface came along. And what happened here, of course, was that they started developing teacher notes for the textbooks. And that was a major development because a lot of teachers find it difficult or a little bit frightening to move from general English teaching into ESP or EST teaching because they don't think they've got the relevant disciplinary skills to be able to teach science students. So the idea of a teacher's book became really important and helped a lot. Fourth generation English for electrical and mechanical engineering, and of course Swales and Feek's classic book, Academic Writing for Graduate Students, came along. And so now what we were doing is we were recognizing things like genre in text development and putting them into textbooks. The fifth generation are things like communication skills for English and medical practitioners. And now we're doing very targeted areas for students like nurses or medical students. And along with the textbooks came DVDs and now online interfaces with these books. They became very colorful. The teachers' books are very, very good, well written. And so we've come a long way in terms of textbook development for ESP. However, keep pressing the wrong button. A while ago, probably about 12, 13 years ago, I started redesigning a course for science students at the City University in Hong Kong. And I did this along with my colleague, Christoph Hafner. And in the process of redesigning this course, we realized that there was a lot of work to be done. It wasn't an easy job, and that we may as well turn it into some kind of research project. So that research project then ran for at least 10 years and resulted in something like 15 publications and the book that I'm talking from today. So that was very productive for us as academics. But also at the end of this process, we had what we thought was a very interesting and relevant course that our students actually enjoyed taking. And so just very quickly about this course, we had to actually deal with something like 250 students each semester from all different departments, biology, chemistry, physics. And we had a mixture, mostly male, but some female students as well, aged around about 20. There were around about 24 in each class, and the majority of students were Hong Kong students with Cantonese as their first language. So we had kind of quite a strong monolingual language group there to teach. And basically, our course aims was to develop the students' ability to read a variety of scientific texts and appropriately communicate speaking and writing and the finding of a scientific project in an academic context. So the project's very important here. Can I do the right one? Yeah. So this kind of explains the course in some way just by looking at the assessment of the course. And so in red here, we've got the scientific video documentary, which was for 40% of the course grade, and then a lab report, an individual piece of work, which was 40%. And these were the main components of this course. So we wanted the students to work in groups, to do something together as a project, but then to take that information they had gathered and reproduce it as a lab report for individual assessment. The projects, we actually gave a lot of help to the students to begin with, because we designed the projects for them, the topics at least. And so we gave the students self-selected into groups of 4 or 5 maybe, and they were given a topic. So something like the blind spot of your eye, taste, how we taste things, light pollution in Hong Kong. And then what the students had to do in a group was go and research this topic, find out something about it from the internet or other sources, could be the other professors, and then collect data, real data in some way, and then present that data orally to their classmates at the end of the course. And also what we had them do is they uploaded their data onto a YouTube video. And so that data was, the video was available for anyone to see actually, which made the task quite interesting for the students, because they weren't just now preparing to present to their teacher, they were preparing to present to the whole class and perhaps a much wider audience as well. And then the second part was obviously present their findings, the same findings, individually as a lab report. So here's the English and Science project, and we have 2 components. And as you see, it wasn't just a case of giving them the topic and saying, okay, we'll see you in 7 weeks. We actually had a very structured approach to the course, where we gave relevant input in the classroom lessons about how to collect data, how to write a script for presentation of the data, doing recordings and performing, editing skills with an online video app, and then there was a sharing element as well. For the lab report, they had to again go back to their readings, they had to write in a disciplinary fashion, they had to edit and proofread and then present it to us, the teacher, for marking. And so this, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is the first part of the course. The course was 13 weeks. And so for the first 7 weeks, we focused on the video. And we gave this very clear structure to the students so that they knew exactly what they had to do each week. And they had a time frame to work from. I find this is very important, because without that support, the students would get a bit lost. And also they were working in a group. So 4 or 5 students could start sort of, arguing with each other or not sharing the work or whatever. But doing it this way and checking in the class that they were keeping track of the schedule meant that we could troubleshoot anything that was going on. Of course, during that period, students needed some help. So we introduced them to little workshops on how to search the internet, how to use cameras and DV editing software, and then, looking at YouTube channels and what was going on there. So the idea, of course, for the group project was that the students were trying to communicate scientific data to a more general audience. For the lab report, it was communicating scientific data to a discipline-specific specialist. So we had these two kind of concepts going on during this course. This is a link which I'm not going to touch at the moment, but it's an example of one of the video projects. And later on, if you like, you can go in and have a look. It's on YouTube, and that link will take you to other videos as well. So if you want to have a look at the product, what the students were able to produce, then go there. And then this was the second part of the course, lab report writing. And again, you can look at this in detail yourself later, but there was a structure in terms of going over with students what was expected in lab reports, and showing them basically examples of lab reports and what they were expected to do with the data, the real data they had collected. And so this is just an example of the format. And as you can see, it's introduction, methods, discussion, results and discussion format. So that's kind of a very brief example of the course. But from that course, we then, in terms of writing for the book, we thought, well, what would an EST course design look like in the future? And what sort of dimensions or elements should there be in this? One thing before I continue is that because we had turned our course design into a research project, we had got access to a lot of information from the students. We did a lot of focus group chats with them. We monitored what was going on in the classrooms a lot of the time. We talked to their professors in the other disciplines. We had lots of meetings with them and talked through what was going on. And so we were able to do this very in-depth needs analysis with the students. And as a result of that, then we came up with these 6 dimensions. Now, the dimensions do not have to be relevant to every single EST or ESP course. They were in our course because we catered to the needs of the students basically, and we thought they were relevant. But I mean, if you were, for example, doing a review of an ESP course, you might like to look at these dimensions and say, well, do we have an element of this in our course design? And if not, why not? And do we want to put it in? So it might be a good basis for discussion with colleagues to review courses, or it might be the basis in which you start developing a new ESP course. So very briefly, I'll just go through these 6 dimensions and why I think they are important. Obviously, with a standard course design procedure, you need to start collecting data about your learners, about their needs and wants, about the facilities you have. Again, in Hong Kong, we had a very privileged context because we had very good technical support, we had good Wi-Fi, all the students were tech savvy, and so we knew, things would work there. In other situations, you might find you'd have to tailor the course design so that it might not have as much technology in it, or the students might need more introduction to some of the dimensions we're going to talk about here. And so the first dimension is learner autonomy. And actually, learner autonomy is a dimension that was relevant to the first course designs around about the early 1970s. People who were writing at that time these short research papers were constantly talking about the fact that the students they were teaching, the technicians or whatever, actually had relevant information that the teacher didn't have. And so the students were giving input to the teacher in these courses. And so there has to be a recognition that the students have got information that they can and maybe want to share with each other or the English language teacher. And so we've got to have an element somewhere of learner autonomy. It might just be some discussions in class about, how would you collect information? How do you approach your learning? How do you help each other? How can you evaluate your work or your peers' work? But there's some sort of element of learner autonomy going on there. What we have to recognize, of course, is that learner autonomy does not equal letting students do whatever they want to do, because that results in chaos. And that's why I said that the structure of the course that we designed was very clear, because it told the students when there was teacher input and when they were required to do something out of class. And so that out of class work was very often the learner autonomy dimension here. Also, the students realized by doing this project that they were taking some responsibility for their learning. And I remember one focus group chat I had with some students, and we were talking about vocabulary and how easy it was to pronounce new words, especially for the camera. And one girl told me that she actually practiced about 10 times her little piece, like, 30 seconds. She practiced it over and over again until she felt she had got it well enough to put it onto a camera. And so that kind of out of class learning and taking responsibility for it is something you very rarely can achieve in the classroom itself. And so we feel that in a way there has to be some element of learner autonomy in a course, an ESP course, and that it might be flexible, of course, and it might have to be discussed with the students, what they can do, what they need to learn to do, and what they can do, or what they can't do, perhaps. Then the central focus of our course was a project. And we did this because projects are real life activities, especially in science and engineering, where people have to work in groups to collaborate to complete some kind of project. You very rarely find an engineer who will work on his own to do a complete project. They're always working with designers, with technicians, with other people to complete a project. So we thought that the project brought authenticity to the task, basically. Also, this project allows learners to integrate their language skills with their learning objective skills. So any kind of language skill, the course was not just to teach English, was not was not how to develop vocabulary, for example, for science. Students were allowed to bring in any language skill they wanted into the project. And that helped them, gave them confidence that they were using language well, but it also helped the other students in the group because there was a lot of peer teaching went on with this project. And sometimes, of course, when we were talking to the students about what was happening, they would very clearly identify, oh, this student's good at English, this student's good at technology, this student's good at videotaping. And so they assigned these roles to each other or to themselves, and they realized what their real life skills were. So we thought that this was kind of linking real life learning with classroom learning to a large extent. And also because the projects were semi-technical, then it encouraged them to use their own disciplinary knowledge in some ways in the project. Also, focus on project is a focus on content. And if students are interested in the content of their project, then they'll be interested in their learning. This, I think, is a big problem with a lot of language courses, where students are just doing it because they have to do the course to get the credits, perhaps, to move on. And they're not really interested in what's going on in the classroom. We found a lot of students in this project course told us that they spent a lot of time on the project, but it was because they were interested in what they were doing. Obviously, there's a lot of flexibility in what they can use as language. They could use English if they wanted all the time. They could use Cantonese and English, use Cantonese if they wanted in terms of the project in order to complete it. And there was a shift in power here. So students took on a lot more responsibility for their learning, and the teacher was more in a facilitator's role here. The main idea about project-based learning is that there's authenticity of texts, audiences, and purpose. And that basically for us created the motivation for the students to complete the projects. And if you've got time to go online to YouTube and have a look at some of these projects, I think you'll be impressed at the performance a lot of the students made in this 7-week project. We have to take into consideration multiliteracies these days, obviously, because a lot of students are working online, they're used to technology, and they expect a lot of other types of learning to take place, not just reading and writing or straight lecturing. So they're used to not just linguistic input, but graphical input and audio input as well. And so when you start combining these things together, then you get a much richer language environment for students to work in. Obviously, technology is moving forward all the time, and so students are keeping up with it very well, much more than we are, I think. And so they're able to use their multiliteracy abilities to do this kind of project. there was a lot of email communication and WhatsApp communication in our students. And what was interesting again was when I looked, the students allowed us to look at all their communications, and a lot of them were on task all the time, and they were using English a lot of the time. So out of class learning, they were actually, even though they could communicate in Chinese together, they were actually using English for doing this, in using the computer mediated communication. Of course, using multiliteracies in the classroom means you have to restructure traditional classroom discourse in some ways to allow for it to happen. And it's still a sort of a grey area in some ways because teachers are unsure how much technology they should be putting into the classroom and how much time students should spend on, for example, using their laptops or mobile phones in the classroom itself, and how much time should be spent on teacher-fronted or what we call real-life classroom interaction. But there's more and more research coming out in this area, and I think it's going to prove sort of very interesting in the future what is going on. But we need to take it into consideration. You can't just ignore technology these days. You can't ignore the multiliteracies of our students. They expect it, basically, in their language learning and in any classroom that they're in these days. Genre was the other dimension, and one of the other dimensions. And again, this was very evident in some of the earlier texts in the 1960s, because basically what they were doing there was that they were taking models from real life, for example, manuals, and showing them to the students and then saying, okay, this is the grammar here, let's see if we can reproduce it. So they were using genre as a model and to help students learn language and learn specific language. But nowadays, of course, the development's not so much on how we communicate, but what we're communicating as well. And because of, again, the explosion of technology and the internet, we're dealing not just with printed material these days, we're dealing with material in a social context. And so students need to be able not only to read a lab report and understand it, they need to be able to talk to people about science and technology in a way which is relevant and easy to understand. By giving students a variety of genres, we allow them to see how language is used in different contexts. And although this has actually become quite important in general language teaching in the past sort of 15 odd years, it's much more important these days, I think, in ESP or EAP. Because students, once you've raised their awareness of how language is used in specific contexts, it becomes a little bit easier for them to think in these terms and not just write general language in what's required of them in an ESP context. Okay, and we've got various writers like Bhatia and Flauju who've brought to our attention this idea that by making students aware of different genres, we're giving them the ability to transfer these skills into other areas as well. And so it's not just for the language classroom that we're doing this. These can be transferred over into the disciplinary classrooms or into their daily lives or into their working lives as well. Now, what we did during our project was an ethnographic investigation. So basically, we were looking at students from lots of dimensions, from our own ideas of being applied linguists, of the students telling us stories about what was happening, of observing them in the classroom, what was happening. And so we were able to build up this very rich set of data, which we think is relevant to ESP course design these days. And what we realize, of course, is that in a classroom context in the universities, learning is quite complex and multi-layered these days. It's not just a simple activity. And so we need to be very aware of this ongoing nature of course development. It's not something you just do, write the course materials and then forget about it. It really has to be something you monitor and keep going back to check if it's working well. And so when we use this ethnographic approach, we get a very deep understanding of how our students' needs, what they are, and if their needs change as well. We had a lot of very frank discussions with our students about their language learning and what was happening in this ESP course. And I think that helped us to become better teachers, basically. Now, one other dimension which was relevant to us, but which might not be relevant in other situations, is the plurilingual aspect. And this came about actually, one day I was actually teaching the course, and I had introduced students to a new online device for editing. And after I had introduced it, the students went into groups with their laptops and they started playing with it to see how it worked. And as I walked around the classroom, I realized that everybody was using Cantonese. But when I looked at what they were doing, everybody was on task. And so they were using their first language in order to understand how better to use this device so that they could then present in their second language. And so it got us thinking about this idea of plurilingual practices. And in some situations, and in particular Hong Kong for a while, there was a trend to say that you could only use English in the classroom. Do not allow students to use their mother tongue. But from our experiences with this project, we realized that the first language was quite often very useful for students if they wanted to use it for specific events or for things which they didn't really understand. They could talk about it together in Cantonese and then maybe even ask the teacher a question or work out how to solve the problem. The issue with plurilingualism, of course, is that it's a very messy and unpredictable aspect. So it's very difficult to write it into a course design. It's just better to say, okay, it might happen, and if it happens, then make sure the students are on task. And if it's helping them to do the task and learn how to present in the second language, then it's fine. And of course, there's bottom-up and top-down approaches to plurilingual practices. So some people say, you should look at what the students are doing in the classroom and accept that. Other people say we should try to engineer it and put it into course design. As I say, it's a messy concept, and it's difficult to say which one is correct here. But it's something, again, which if you're working in a monolingual context, it'd be very useful to have a little discussion with your other colleagues and probably with heads of departments who might object to the students using their first language in the English classroom, and just to say, can it be of use and how would we allow students to use it? So, as I say, I'm sorry for rushing through this a little bit, but in conclusion, I still think EST is quite an exciting and growing area of development within applied linguistics. And part of that, of course, is because we're just adding to our knowledge all the time. And especially with the advent of technology these days, we just need to keep up with what the students are doing, how they're communicating with each other, and perhaps bring some of it into our course development so that it's relevant to the students as well. It's what we might say is a progressive pedagogical approach. And when I teach in Hong Kong and I talk to school teachers there, it's quite interesting because a lot of them will admit that they still use a grammar translation approach in the classroom. And if you look chronologically, the grammar translation approach is 1900s, basically 1910. But there's nothing wrong with that because they're doing it in a way which is relevant to the students. However, if that's the only thing they're doing, then there might be a problem, because students are much more sophisticated these days in the 21st century. They don't only, want their learning to be engaging and different. They expect it as well. And so teachers have to look at their courses and think, am I doing what I need to do for the students here? And am I doing what the students want me to do here as well? Okay, so that's just over half an hour or so I've been speaking, but Jason threatened me that I had to stop after half an hour because he said there might be some questions or debate. So I'm very happy to sit here and listen to you or try to answer some questions.